Australia, much like the rest of the world, has been experiencing a major cost of living crisis over the past year, with high inflation, skyrocketing rents and interest rates, and hugely increased travel costs, with the price of petrol having risen close to 20% in just 12 months. But on that last point, one Australian state came up with an interesting solution to make travelling at least a bit more cost effective. From the end of December and all the way through January, Western Australia made all of its public buses, trains and even ferries free to use. This got people pretty excited as the savings weren't insubstantial. A family of 4 travelling from the suburbs into Perth's city centre would be saving an estimated $30 on the return trip. And this change proved to be very popular, with public transport ridership up a whopping 42% over the same time last year. This was also not Perth's first go at free public transport. There was already a policy in place to make public transport free on the first Sunday of each month, and this policy had proved pretty popular, with ridership being about 15% higher on those Sundays. So, free public transport in Perth has clearly proved to be quite effective at getting people out and about, as well as encouraging people away from their cars and towards mass transit. But should Western Australia make its public transport free permanently? And should other cities around Australia, and across the world, do the same? Well, free public transport definitely comes with some benefits, especially the increased ridership. As we've already seen, when WA had its free public transport days, ridership increased. And it's not alone in this. When Tasmania made its public buses free for the month of April in 2022, they saw their ridership increase by 15%. And when the city of Hasselt in Belgium made their public transport free, they saw an astronomical 10-fold increase in its ridership. You don't even have to go all the way to free to start seeing an impact. Simply reducing fares can boost patronage as well. When the state of Victoria slashed the costs of their regional V-Line train fares, they saw such a big jump in ridership that people were worried that overcrowding could become an issue. But those free and reduced fares have to come from somewhere. In Western Australia's case, the month of free public transport cost the state $10 million in lost ticket revenue. So you'd be looking at around $100 to $200 million over the course of an entire year. And that Belgian city that saw a 10-fold increase in its public transport usage? Well, it also saw a 10-fold increase in its public transport maintenance and staffing costs. So, I guess as you would expect, no or low-cost public transport obviously is going to cost the government quite a lot of money. But then again, so does driving. It might not be as immediately obvious in the budget papers as public transport expenditure, but taxpayers are spending a lot of money subsidising cars as well. From zoning laws that promote car-dependent suburban sprawl, to the costs of road construction and maintenance, to the various car and truck subsidies, there are a lot of ways governments encourage and actively pay for car ownership. In fact, research out of Germany found that a single small car can cost society upwards of $275,000. So you can see how, if you account for all the cars there are in a country, many of which are far from small, that adds up. So then, does it really matter if reducing the cost of public transport will cost the government a bit more? The government is typically subsidising the cost of our transit tickets already. The story differs from place to place, but in the USA, for example, the cost of a ticket is only paying for around 36% of the total cost to provide you with that service. And if it helps reduce the number of people who feel the need to own a car, given how much they apparently cost taxpayers, the cost might not be as big as we might think. On top of that, there are many other small ways increasing public transport usage can save the government money while benefiting society as a whole. People who use public transport instead of cars tend to lead more active lifestyles, reducing the risk of things like diabetes. And of course, using public transport is far better for the environment than driving. So if governments are willing to spend billions of dollars fighting climate change, like the Western Australian government which recently committed $3 billion to that cause in their 2023 budget, then surely some of that money can be spent making lower emission public transport cheaper to use. But that does bring me to one of the issues with free public transport systems. The increases in ridership they seem to achieve don't always come from car riders. The capital of Estonia, Tallinn, made much of their public transport free in 2013, and they, like Perth, saw a substantial increase in ridership. And the policy proved so popular that many other towns and cities in Estonia have also adopted it. But there was a bit of a catch. It turned out a lot of the new trips being made on public transport were being done by people who had previously chosen to walk, with walking trips declining a whopping 40%, while trips made by car only decreased by 5%. So if the goal of free public transport is to reduce car usage, that's not always a guarantee. That's not to say it never works. When Germany introduced a month-long transit pass that cost just €9, they did see a decline in car congestion in most cities. But it does mean it's not a golden bullet that can turn a car-dependent city into a mass transit utopia overnight. If you live somewhere where it's going to take you 2 to 3 times longer to get where you want to go by public transport than by car, and it's going to involve routes that include taking multiple often infrequent and unreliable bus services, like somebody from the Perth suburb of Mirrabooka who wants to spend a day in Fremantle for example, well, it doesn't matter how cheap the fare is, you're probably still going to drive. If you actually want to get someone in that scenario to consider transit over their car, what you really need to do is improve the transit services available to them. There is plenty of evidence for this. A study on bus service in North America found that when fuel prices go up, transit usage increases, but only slightly. But when you improve the actual bus service, the increase in ridership is much bigger. Looking to the other side of Australia, you can see what I mean. Sydney and Melbourne are very similarly sized cities, but Sydney's train network actually gets something like 50% more usage than Melbourne's. And among the reasons for this is that Sydney's rail network has much better frequencies, with most stations getting trains every few minutes, while in Melbourne, waits of up to 20 minutes aren't uncommon in the off-peak. When transit comes more often, people have more flexibility when taking public transport, and as a result, more people choose it. The same thing applies to building more transit. If that person in Mirrabooka could do more of their journey in grade-separated transit, like trains for example, transit would become a much more compelling option. When we construct new high-quality public transport, things like metros, light rails, and even bus rapid transit, we expand the transit network to new people, giving them new options for how they travel. Much like building highways causes induced demand that encourages more people to drive, building transit induces its own demand too. Cities like London have quite notoriously expensive transit systems, but because their system is so extensive, so convenient and has such good frequencies, it gets really good ridership in spite of its price. Now, in fairness to Perth, they are actually doing a lot to expand their network, with the very ambitious Metronet project, which is something I definitely want to do a video on in the future, so subscribe if you want to see that. But ultimately, I think reducing or even removing the cost of public transport can be an important and effective part of how cities boost their public transport ridership. And while I'd like to see more cities at least reduce some of their fare prices, I don't think this can take the place of making actual improvements to their public transport networks, through things like increased frequencies, improved routes, and building new lines. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd like to hear what you guys think about free public transport. Would it be something you'd like to see in your city? And if you did enjoy the video, consider giving it a like